The mist rolled thick across Lake Ontario that early October morning, wrapping the shoreline in a ghostly embrace that made even familiar landmarks seem strange and otherworldly. The lake's surface was a mirror of slate gray, disturbed only by gentle ripples that whispered against the hull of David Mitchell's weathered fishing boat. For 20 years, these dawn excursions had been his sanctuary, a place where the complexities of life dissolved into the simple rhythm of waves and wind. But on this particular morning, the peaceful scene would shatter into a moment that would haunt him forever. David's hands trembled slightly as he lifted his coffee mug to his lips, his other hand resting lightly on the wheel. The hot liquid did little to warm the chill that had settled in his bones, not from the autumn air, but from the memory of those desperate eyes he'd seen just moments before. He could still hear Sarah's scream, see her pointing frantically through the fog, and feel that sickening lurch in his stomach when they realized what they were witnessing. It had started like any other morning. David, a search and rescue veteran turned marina owner, had invited Sarah Cooper, the local veterinarian, for what was supposed to be a peaceful fishing trip. Sarah had recently lost her mother to cancer, and David thought the tranquility of the lake might offer some solace. They had been friends for years, bonded by their shared love of animals and the quiet majesty of Lake Ontario. The first hint that something was wrong came with a sound, not the usual lap of waves or the cry of gulls, but something more primal, a desperate splashing, punctuated by what could only be described as screams. At first, they dismissed it as waterfowl, perhaps a loon crying out in the dawn, but then Sarah had seen it. David. Her coffee cup had crashed to the deck, hot liquid spreading across the weathered boards. Over there. Oh my God, David, look. Through the thinning wisps of fog, about 40 yards from their boat, a large dog was fighting for its life. Its dark head barely broke the surface, powerful limbs churning the water in increasingly frantic movements. Each wave threatened to push it under, and even from this distance, they could see the exhaustion in its struggles. David's trained eye took in the details with professional precision. The dog was big, probably a Newfoundland or similar breed. Its thick fur now a deadly weight, dragging it down. By the way it moved, he could tell it had been in the water for some time, too long. Its movements were becoming erratic, desperate, and what hit David hardest were its eyes, intelligent, terrified eyes that locked onto their boat with an almost human awareness of its fate. Sarah gripped the rail, her knuckles white. "We have to do something. It's drowning." But David hesitated, his mind racing with the possibilities and dangers. He'd seen what panicked animals could do, how fear could turn even the gentlest creature into something dangerous. A drowning dog of that size could easily pull down a would-be rescuer, or in its panic, it might capsize their boat, leaving all three of them at the mercy of the cold October waters. The dog's head disappeared beneath a wave, and Sarah's gasp cut through the morning air like a knife. When it resurfaced, its struggles were noticeably weaker. Those eyes, when they found the boat again, held something that shook David to his core, not just fear now, but a pleading that transcended species. "Sarah," he said, his voice tight with tension. "If we do this, everything has to be perfect. One mistake, and we could all die out here." She turned to him, tears streaming down her face. "We can't just watch it die, David. We can't." The dog's head went under again, longer this time. When it came up, its movements were sluggish and uncoordinated. David knew they had seconds, not minutes, to make a decision that could cost them their lives. In that moment, time seemed to slow. The fog parted slightly, revealing the full scene in cruel clarity, the struggling dog, its dark fur glistening in the weak morning light, each desperate paddle growing weaker than the last. Sarah's quiet sobs beside him, the gentle rocking of their boat, now the only thing standing between life and death for this creature that, through some twist of fate, had crossed their path. David's hands tightened on the wheel. 20 years of search and rescue experience screamed at him about the risks, the protocols, the reasons to stay back. But something else, something deeper than training or logic, was rising in his chest. He looked at Sarah, saw in her eyes the same determination he felt building in his heart. "Get the rescue line," he said quietly, already turning the boat toward the drowning animal. "And Sarah, whatever happens next, pray we're not about to make the biggest mistake of our lives." If this story of courage, compassion, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals has touched your heart, subscribe now to witness the breathtaking moments that followed, moments that would challenge everything these rescuers thought they knew about the depth of animal intelligence and the power of trust between species. Time seemed to crystallize in the moments that followed, each second stretching like honey as David maneuvered their boat through the morning mist. Sarah scrambled to gather rescue equipment, her medical training warring with the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. The dog's struggles grew weaker with each passing moment, its massive head barely breaking the surface between waves. David Mitchell was no stranger to life-or-death situations. His 20 years with search and rescue had put him face-to-face with death more times than he cared to remember. Each rescue had left its mark: the midnight call for a lost hiker in a blizzard, the capsized kayaker caught in spring rapids, the child who'd fallen through winter ice. But this was different. Animals were unpredictable, and a drowning dog of this size could spell disaster for everyone involved. He had seen what panic could do to creatures, both human and animal. Once, early in his career, he'd watched a startled horse kick a stable hand clear across a paddock. Sarah had been the attending vet that day, and together they learned a harsh lesson about the raw power of frightened animals. Now, as he guided the boat closer to the struggling dog, those memories flashed through his mind like warning signals. Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts, steady despite her trembling hands. "I've got the rescue line and the life ring, but David..." She hesitated, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. "I've never seen a dog this big. It must be at least 150 pounds, maybe more." She was right. Up close, the dog's size became even more apparent. Its broad chest and powerful shoulders spoke of a breed built for water, probably a Newfoundland, though its waterlogged fur made it hard to be certain. In normal circumstances, such dogs were excellent swimmers. Something had gone terribly wrong to leave this one fighting for its life so far from shore. The fog swirled around them as David cut the engine, letting their momentum carry them closer. The sound of the dog's labored breathing carried across the water, each gasp more desperate than the last. Its dark eyes locked onto them, and in that gaze, David saw something that made his heart clench, not just fear, but a glimmer of recognition, an awareness that help had arrived. "Easy now," David murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "Easy." Sarah moved to the boat's edge, rescue line ready. Her years of handling large animals showed in her careful movements, but David could see the tension in her shoulders. One wrong move, one moment of panic, and the situation could turn deadly in seconds. The dog's head slipped under again, and this time, the seconds stretched agonizingly before it resurfaced. When it did, its movements were alarmingly weak, its powerful limbs moving more from instinct than conscious effort. The cold water had done its work, sapping the animal's strength with merciless efficiency. Sarah made her first attempt with the rescue line, aiming for the dog's shoulders. The rope fell short, creating ripples that sent the animal into fresh panic. Its thrashing turned the water into foam, and for a terrifying moment, it disappeared completely beneath the surface. "No!" Sarah's cry echoed across the water. When the dog reappeared, it was barely swimming, its movements now little more than twitches against the inevitable. David's mind raced through options, each seeming more desperate than the last. The rescue line might work, but they needed to get closer, dangerously closer. The life ring was useless, the dog was too far gone to grab it. Time was running out. "Sarah," he said, his voice tight with tension. "We need to try something else. I'm going to bring us alongside." Her head snapped around, eyes wide. "David, if it panics." "I know," he met her gaze steadily. "But it's dying. We have to risk it." With practiced precision, David guided the boat closer, using the wind and current to their advantage. The dog was less than 10 feet away now, close enough to see the gray starting to show around its muzzle. Not a young dog, then, which might explain its presence so far from shore. Perhaps it had become disoriented, led astray by failing senses. Sarah readied herself at the rail, new determination settling over her features. As a vet, she'd sworn to help animals in need, and professional distance be damned. She wasn't about to watch this one die. The next few moments unfolded in a blur of action. David brought them within arm's reach of the struggling animal. The boat's hull now acting as a barrier against the deeper water, Sarah, timing her movements perfectly with the waves, managed to get the rescue line around the dog's chest, just behind its front legs. But success turned to crisis in an instant. The touch of the rope sent the dog into a final, desperate surge of panic. Its powerful legs churned the water, one massive paw catching the boat's edge. The vessel lurched dangerously, and icy water poured over the gunwale. "Hold on!" David shouted, fighting to stabilize the boat. Sarah had fallen to her knees but maintained her grip on the rope, her face set in grim determination. The dog's struggles began to weaken again, but now they had a chance. Together, they started to pull, every muscle straining against the weight of the waterlogged animal. The boat rocked dangerously with each movement, threatening to tip them all into the frigid lake. Through it all, those intelligent eyes never left them. Even in its panic, even as its strength failed, the dog seemed to understand on some level that these humans were trying to help. Its struggles, though still dangerous, became less frantic, more focused on staying above water than fighting the rope. As they fought to bring the massive animal alongside, David caught Sarah's eye. In that moment, they shared an understanding that transcended words. They were committed now, for better or worse. Whatever happened next would test everything they knew about rescue, about animals, and about themselves. The morning fog continued to swirl around them, creating an otherworldly scene. Two humans and a dying dog suspended between salvation and disaster on the gray waters of Lake Ontario. The next few minutes would determine not just the dog's fate, but perhaps their own as well. The critical moment arrived with the force of a thunderclap. David and Sarah had managed to get the massive dog alongside their boat but now faced their greatest challenge yet. The animal's weight, amplified by its waterlogged fur, threatened to capsize them with every attempt to lift it aboard. The morning air filled with the sound of their laboring breath and the occasional whimper from their exhausted rescue subject. On 3, David called out, his muscles trembling from the strain of holding the rescue line. Sarah nodded, her face a mask of determination, despite the fear evident in her eyes. They had one chance at this, one opportunity to save this creature before exhaustion claimed them all. The dog's dark eyes, once wild with panic, now held a glazed look that Sarah recognized all too well from her years as a veterinarian. Hypothermia was setting in, and the window for rescue was closing fast. Its massive head rested against the boat's hull, each breath creating small ripples in the water. David adjusted his grip, planting his feet firmly. 2. Sarah's hand tightened on the rope, ignoring the burning sensation where it had already rubbed her palms raw. 3. They heaved upward with everything they had, their joints screaming in protest. The dog's weight seemed impossible, far more than the 150 pounds they'd estimated. Water cascaded from its fur as its massive form began to rise from the lake, each drop adding to the growing pool at their feet. For one heart-stopping moment, the boat tilted dangerously to port, water rushing over the gunwale. "Shift right," David shouted. Sarah responded instantly, throwing her weight to the opposite side while somehow maintaining her grip on the rope. The dog, in what seemed like a moment of extraordinary understanding, made a final effort of its own. As they pulled, it gathered its remaining strength and lunged upward, its powerful front leg scrabbling at the boat's edge. The movement, combined with their pulling, created the momentum they needed. With a tremendous splash and heave, the dog crashed onto the deck. Water exploded everywhere, soaking them completely, but neither rescuer cared. They'd done it. The impossible had become possible. But their triumph was short-lived. The dog lay motionless on the deck, its chest barely rising with each shallow breath. Sarah immediately switched into veterinary mode, her professional instincts overriding exhaustion. "He's hypothermic," she said, already moving toward their supply compartment. "We need to get him warm now." The use of heat came naturally. She could now see their rescue was indeed a male, and an older one at that. David watched the animal closely as Sarah worked, ready to intervene if it showed any sign of aggression. But the dog remained still, only his eyes moving to follow their actions. Those eyes held something that David had never seen before in an animal, a deep, almost human-like awareness of what had just transpired. Sarah returned with emergency blankets and their spare clothing. With gentle movements that belied her exhaustion, she began to towel off the dog's fur, speaking softly all the while. "You're safe now, big guy. We've got you. You're going to be okay." The dog's response defied everything David knew about wild or panicked animals. Instead of flinching from Sarah's touch, he leaned slightly into it, as if understanding her efforts to help. His breathing began to steady, though shivers still racked his massive frame. "Look at his paws," Sarah murmured, her hands moving carefully over the dog's body, checking for injuries. "They're huge, but well-maintained. This isn't a stray. He belongs to someone." David nodded, noticing the same signs of care, the trimmed nails, the lack of matting in the fur despite its current sodden state. No collar, though. He must have lost it in the water. As they worked to warm and stabilize their passenger, the fog began to lift, revealing more of the lake around them. The shoreline was still frustratingly distant, a dark smudge on the horizon. They had drifted further out during the rescue than David had realized. Sarah's examination continued, her touch gentle but thorough. "No obvious injuries," she reported, "but his muscles are trembling from exhaustion. We need to get him ashore as soon as possible." The dog's eyes had begun to clear somewhat. The glaze was receding as warmth returned to his body. He made no attempt to rise, seeming to understand the precariousness of their situation on the small boat. Instead, he lay quietly, accepting their care with a dignity that struck both rescuers deeply. David started the engine, its rumble breaking the strange spell that had fallen over them. The dog's ears twitched at the sound, but he remained calm, his eyes now fixed on the horizon as if he too longed for the safety of solid ground. As they began their journey back, Sarah continued her ministrations, wrapping the dog in emergency blankets and monitoring his breathing. "You know," she said softly, "in all my years of veterinary work, I've never seen anything quite like this. He's so aware." David understood what she meant. There was something extraordinary about this animal, something that went beyond normal dog behavior. The way it had worked with them during the rescue, its current calm acceptance of their help, it all spoke of an intelligence that seemed almost supernatural. A particularly large wave rocked the boat, and the dog shifted his weight automatically to help stabilize them, much as a human passenger would. Sarah and David exchanged glances, both recognizing the remarkable nature of this simple action. The morning sun had finally broken through the fog, casting long shadows across the deck. In clearer light, they could see their rescue was indeed a Newfoundland. His fur, deep black, would shine magnificently once dry. Despite his exhaustion, there was an undeniable nobility in his bearing, a presence that commanded respect, even in his weakened state. As they pressed on toward shore, both rescuers found themselves wondering about the series of events that had led to this moment. How such a magnificent animal had ended up so far from safety, whose heart was breaking right now, searching for their missing companion, and most intriguingly, what had made this dog trust them so completely in his moment of greatest need. The answers lay ahead of them, somewhere on the approaching shoreline, but for now, they focused on the miracle they had been part of, a rescue that defied explanation, a connection that transcended the usual boundaries between humans and animals. The dog's steady breathing provided a counterpoint to the engine's rhythm as they made their way home, each passing wave bringing them closer to the next chapter of this extraordinary morning. The journey back to shore became a delicate dance of trust and instinct. David kept one hand steady on the wheel while constantly monitoring their unusual passenger in his peripheral vision. 2 decades of rescue work had taught him that the moments following a save were often the most dangerous when adrenaline faded, and unexpected complications could arise. But the massive Newfoundland continued to defy everything he thought he knew about animal behavior. Rather than showing signs of fear or aggression once his strength began returning, the dog maintained an almost supernatural calm. His eyes, now alert and clear, moved between his rescuers with an intelligence that made the hair on the back of David's neck stand up. Every few minutes, the dog would adjust his position to compensate for the boat's movement, displaying a level of awareness that seemed impossible for an animal that had been nearly dead just 30 minutes ago. Sarah sat close to their rescue, her veterinary instincts warring with her amazement at the situation. She had treated countless dogs over her career, from tiny Chihuahuas to massive Great Danes, but never had she encountered one quite like this. The dog's responses to her examination were unlike anything in her experience. "Look at this," she murmured to David, demonstrating how the dog would lift his paw before she even reached for it, anticipating her needs. "It's like he knows exactly what I'm checking for." The dog's eyes met hers as if acknowledging her observation, and Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with her wet clothes. There was something in that gaze, not just intelligence, but a depth of understanding that challenged everything she thought she knew about animal consciousness. A particularly large wave rocked the boat, sending spray across the deck. David tensed, ready for the dog to panic, but instead, their unusual passenger simply shifted his weight to the high side, helping to stabilize the vessel. The movement was so natural, so perfectly timed, that it seemed rehearsed. "David," Sarah said quietly, "I've never seen anything like this. Even the most well-trained service dogs don't show this level of situational awareness." As if to prove her point, the dog turned his massive head toward her and let out a soft woof of breath, not quite a bark, but clearly a deliberate communication. His tail, though still heavy with water, thumped once against the deck in what seemed like agreement. David found himself chuckling despite the tension of the situation. "Maybe we should check him for a scuba license while we're at it." The joke broke some of the supernatural tension that had built up, but the mystery of their passenger only deepened as they continued their journey. When Sarah opened their cooler to get a bottle of water for herself, the dog's eyes followed her movements with clear interest. She paused, then poured some water into her cup palm, offering it to him. The gentleness with which the massive animal lapped water from her hand left both rescuers speechless. Despite his size and obvious thirst, he took the water carefully without grabbing or pushing. When he had had enough, he pulled back slightly and gave what could only be described as a polite nod. "Okay, that's just," David shook his head, unable to find words to describe what they were witnessing. The sun had risen higher now, burning away the last wisps of morning fog. In clearer light, they could see their passenger better. His fur, though still damp, was beginning to dry in patches, revealing a glossy black coat that spoke of excellent care. There were no signs of neglect or abuse. This was clearly a beloved pet, not a stray. "He must have a family going out of their minds with worry," Sarah said, running her hand gently along the dog's broad back. The dog turned to look at her, and something in his expression made her catch her breath. "You know what I'm saying, don't you? You understand us." The dog's response was subtle but unmistakable. He shifted slightly, pressing against her leg in what seemed like reassurance, then turned his gaze toward the approaching shoreline. His ears perked forward and his nose lifted slightly, testing the wind. David watched this interaction with growing amazement. In all his years of rescue work, he had seen animals display remarkable intelligence and emotional capacity, but this was different. This wasn't just a trained response or learned behavior. This dog was demonstrating a level of comprehension and interaction that bordered on the supernatural. A memory surfaced, something he'd read years ago about Newfoundlands being known as gentle giants and remarkable water rescue dogs. Their breed history included countless stories of spontaneous rescues where the dogs had saved drowning victims without any training. But this situation was the reverse. They had saved him, and his response was anything but typical. As they drew closer to shore, the dog's behavior continued to astound them. When David needed to adjust their course to account for a sudden wind change, the dog had moved to the center of the boat before he even asked, perfectly balancing their weight distribution. When Sarah sneezed suddenly, the dog had turned to her with what could only be described as concern, waiting until she smiled reassuringly before settling back down. "You know," Sarah said thoughtfully, "there are studies about animal intelligence that suggest we barely scratch the surface of what they're capable of. Some researchers believe that dogs in particular have evolved alongside humans to such a degree that they can read our emotions and intentions better than we realize." The dog's ears twitched at her words, and he turned to regard her with those impossibly knowing eyes. For a moment, the three of them sat in silence, the only sounds the gentle slap of waves against the hull and the steady purr of the engine. The shore was growing larger now, details becoming clear through the morning light. Soon, they would face the practical challenges of landing the boat and figuring out where this remarkable animal belonged. But for now, they remained suspended in this extraordinary moment, where the usual barriers between human and animal had somehow dissolved. David glanced at their passenger, then at Sarah, seeing her face mirror the same mix of wonder and confusion he felt. They had set out that morning expecting a routine fishing trip and instead found themselves part of something that defied explanation. The dog's presence on their small boat had transformed it into a space where the impossible seemed not just possible, but natural. As they approached the marina, both rescuers knew that whatever happened next, their understanding of the relationship between humans and animals had been forever altered by this extraordinary encounter. The approach to shore at Haven Marina stirred a new kind of tension in the boat. David guided them past the outer breakwater, his experienced hands gentle on the wheel as they entered the maze of moored vessels. The morning sun now bathed everything in golden light, transforming their extraordinary rescue into something that felt almost dreamlike. Their passenger, however, remained anything but passive. As they entered the marina, the massive Newfoundland rose slowly to his feet, his movements careful and deliberate on the still rocking deck. Both Sarah and David tensed, ready for any sign of distress, but the dog's behavior continued to amaze them. "Look at how he's balancing," Sarah whispered, watching as the dog adjusted his stance with each turn of the boat. "It's like he's done this 100 times before." The dog's attention was now fixed on the shore, his nose working overtime as they drew closer to land. His entire demeanor had changed. There was an alertness, an anticipation, that hadn't been there before. Whatever had led to his near drowning in the lake, it was clear he recognized something about their location. David began the delicate process of maneuvering into their slip, a task made more challenging by their unusual passenger's size and weight. But before he could call out instructions, the dog had already moved to the perfect position, distributing his bulk exactly where it needed to be for a smooth docking. "Okay, that's just showing off now," David muttered, drawing a small laugh from Sarah as they secured the boat. A commotion started on the dock. The early morning regulars, other fishermen, dock workers, and marina staff had noticed something unusual about their return. Soon, a small crowd had gathered, their murmured conversations carrying across the water. "Is that a dog? Where did they find it? My God, look at the size of that thing." The Newfoundland's response to the attention was remarkable. Rather than showing anxiety at the crowd, he sat regally on the deck, his bearing almost dignified despite his still damp fur. There was something almost theatrical about his pose, as if he understood he was part of an extraordinary story. "We're going to need help getting him off the boat," Sarah said. The distance between the deck and the dock, even with the dog's apparent cooperation, made any movement potentially dangerous. But before they could call for assistance, a sharp cry cut through the morning air. "Atlas!" The effect on their passenger was electric. The dog's head snapped up, ears forward, every muscle suddenly alert. A strong bark, his first since the rescue, echoed across the marina. Through the crowd came a running figure, a young woman in her early 30s, her face a mask of disbelief and hope. "Atlas, oh my God, Atlas!" The dog Atlas began to whine, his tail thumping against the deck with increasing urgency. But still, he didn't move, didn't try to jump from the boat. Instead, he looked at David, then at the dock, as if asking permission. "Well," David said, his throat unexpectedly tight, "I guess we know your name now, big fellow." The young woman reached the boat just as they were securing the final line. Her hands gripped the railing, knuckles white. How? Where did you find him? He's been missing since yesterday afternoon. We've been searching all night. Sarah helped her aboard, watching as Atlas finally moved, approaching his owner with what could only be described as deliberate gentleness. The reunion that followed brought tears to every eye on the dock. "My name's Emma," the woman managed between sobs, her arms wrapped around her dog's massive neck. "Atlas is a therapy dog. We work with children at the hospital. Yesterday, we were at the lakeside park for a special session, and he just disappeared. We couldn't understand it. He never runs off. Never." Atlas pressed against her, his eyes closing in contentment. But there was something about his posture that caught David's attention. The dog kept glancing toward the lake, then back at his own owner, as if trying to communicate something. Sarah, her veterinary instincts still active, watched the interaction closely. "Emma, could something have spooked him, made him run toward the water?" Emma wiped her eyes, one hand still buried in Atlas's fur. "There was a child," she said slowly, the memory clearly painful. "A little boy having a severe anxiety attack. Atlas was working with him, doing so well, and then," she paused, realization dawning on her face. "Then the boy ran. He was heading toward the water. Atlas always follows children who are in distress. It's part of his training. But we found the boy safe at home later. Atlas must have kept going, looking for him." The pieces began falling into place, Atlas's presence so far out in the lake, his extraordinary behavior during the rescue and aftermath. It all made sense. This wasn't just any dog. This was a highly trained therapy animal, one accustomed to reading human emotions and responding to complex situations. But even that didn't fully explain everything they'd witnessed, the level of awareness, the almost supernatural understanding he'd shown. There was still something extraordinary about Atlas that transcended mere training. As the story spread across the dock, more people gathered. Someone brought towels, another appeared with a thermos of hot coffee. Atlas accepted the attention with characteristic grace, staying close to Emma but acknowledging each person who approached with a gentle look or a soft whiff of breath. David and Sarah shared a glance, both recognizing that while they might have saved Atlas from drowning, he had given them something equally valuable, a glimpse into the true depths of animal intelligence and emotional capacity. The morning sun climbed higher, drying Atlas's fur into a magnificent black mane as Emma shared more about their work at the hospital, about the lives this gentle giant had touched and changed. David found himself thinking about the mysteries that still lurk beneath the surface of human-animal relationships. They had set out that morning expecting nothing more than a peaceful fishing trip. Instead, they became part of something that would challenge their understanding of the boundaries between species, of the capacity for trust and intelligence in the animals that share our world. And through it all, Atlas watched them with those knowing eyes, as if aware that his story was far from over. The story of Atlas's rescue spread to the lakeside community like wildfire, growing more remarkable with each telling. In the weeks that followed, David and Sarah found themselves at the center of something that had grown far beyond a simple rescue. Their experience that misty morning had sparked conversations about animal intelligence and the mysterious bonds between humans and their four-legged companions. Emma had insisted they come visit Atlas at the children's hospital, where he worked. On a bright autumn afternoon, they watched in amazement as the same dog they pulled from Lake Ontario's frigid waters moved with gentle purpose through the pediatric ward. His presence transformed sterile hospital rooms into spaces of comfort and healing. It's like he remembers, Sarah whispered to David, watching Atlas rest his massive head on the lap of a young cancer patient. The girl, who, according to the nurses, hadn't smiled in days, was now giggling as she ran her fingers through his thick fur. "Look at how he keeps checking on us." She was right. Throughout his rounds, Atlas would occasionally glance their way, those intelligent eyes holding the same knowing look they'd seen on the boat. Each time he did, David felt a shiver of recognition, a reminder of that extraordinary morning. Emma joined them in the hospital's small garden later that afternoon. Atlas settled between them with a contented sigh. "He's different since that day," she said, scratching behind his ears. "It's subtle, but I can see it. It's like he understands things on a deeper level now." David nodded, remembering how Atlas had helped balance the boat, how he anticipated their needs during the rescue. "Near-death experiences change everyone," he said thoughtfully. "Maybe they change animals too." The impact of their story reached far beyond the hospital walls. Local wildlife organizations reported increased interest in water safety for pets. The marina where David worked began offering pet jacket rentals and water safety classes for dog owners. Sarah's veterinary practice saw a surge of people asking about their pets' cognitive abilities and emotional intelligence. But the most profound changes were more personal. David found himself approaching his rescue work differently, paying closer attention to the subtle signals and unspoken communications that could mean the difference between life and death. Sarah's veterinary practice evolved too, incorporating new methods of understanding and working with animals' emotional states. One crisp morning, about a month after the rescue, David arrived at the marina to find Atlas and Emma waiting by his boat. The dog's tail wagged in greeting, and David could have sworn there was a gleam of mischief in those dark eyes. "He insisted on coming down to the water," Emma explained, smiling. "Ever since that day, he's had this connection to the lake. It's like he's watching over it." As if to confirm her words, Atlas walked confidently onto the boat, taking up his position exactly where he'd laid that fateful morning. His posture was relaxed but alert, nose testing the wind as he gazed out over the water. "The kids at the hospital love hearing the story," Emma continued, watching her companion with obvious pride. "They call him the guardian of the lake now. Some of them even say he can talk to the water spirits." She laughed softly. "And sometimes, watching him like this, I almost believe it myself." Sarah arrived then, carrying her medical bag. She had started joining their morning fishing trips regularly now, their shared experience having forged a deeper bond between all of them. Atlas greeted her with his characteristic gentle courtesy, moving slightly to make room for her on the deck. As they pulled away from the dock, David couldn't help but reflect on how one morning had changed so many lives. The children at the hospital had a new hero in their massive four-legged friend. The local community had gained a deeper appreciation for the intelligence and emotional capacity of animals. And he and Sarah had discovered something profound about the connections possible between species. Atlas stood at the bow, his fur gleaming in the morning sun, every inch the noble creature they encountered that foggy morning. As they passed the spot where the rescue had occurred, he turned to look at them. And in that moment, they could see it all again, the desperate struggle, the trust that had transcended species, the miracle they'd all been part of. "You know," Sarah said softly, "I've been thinking about what we witnessed that day. Science talks about animal intelligence, about the evolution of consciousness. But what if there's something more? What if there are depths to their awareness that we're only beginning to understand?" Emma smiled, watching as Atlas returned his gaze to the horizon. "The children believe he's magical," she said. "And after what you've told me about that morning, about how he helped with his own rescue, how he understood exactly what needed to be done, sometimes I think they might be right." David steered them through the gentle morning waves. The lake, peaceful under the rising sun. Atlas had changed position slightly, adjusting to keep the boat perfectly balanced, a habit he maintained since that memorable morning. His presence had become a regular part of their dawn excursions, as if he too wanted to remember and honor what had happened here. As they floated on the calm waters of Lake Ontario, all of them understood that they had been part of something extraordinary. The story of Atlas's rescue had become more than just a tale of survival. It was a reminder of the mysteries that still existed in the relationship between humans and animals, of the depths of intelligence and emotion that lay behind those knowing eyes. Atlas let out a soft woof of contentment, his tail thumping gently against the deck. The morning sun caught his fur, creating a halo effect that made him look almost mythical. Perhaps they all thought there was a touch of magic in him after all, not the kind found in fairy tales, but the deeper magic of trust, intelligence, and the unspoken bonds that connect all living things. And as they watched their gentle giant standing guard over his beloved lake, they knew that some stories don't end. They simply ripple outward, touching lives and changing hearts, like waves spreading across the surface of a peaceful morning lake.